Welcome to the 2020-25 Dewey Lecture. We're delighted to welcome Cass Sunstein as this year's lecturer. But before I introduce him, let me say a few words about the Dewey Lecture. As you know, the University of Chicago Law School was founded in 1902 with the goal of creating a new kind of law school, professional in its purpose, but with a broader outlook than was then prevalent at the nation's leading law schools. The vision was for a law school dedicated to intellectual inquiry and with an innovative spirit. And the aspiration of the new law school was for legal education within a university setting. Now, our founding president, William Rainey Harper, wrote that a true legal education in the law must include, and here I'll quote, an implied scientific knowledge of the law and of legal and juristic methods. It requires a clear comprehension of the historic forces of which humanity is a product, the social environment in which we are in living contact. The scientific study of the law includes the related sciences of history, economics, philosophy, the whole field of social humanity. And so today we refer to this as the interdisciplinary approach to the study of law. And the Dewey Lecture highlights and reaffirms our law school's commitment to this approach to the study of law. In this lecture series brings scholars to the law school to explore the philosophical foundation of law and lawmaking. The lecture was founded more than 40 years ago in honor of John Dewey. Dewey's connections to the university are deep and multifaceted. From the university's founding, and for its first 10 years, Dewey was the chair of our philosophy department. And during that time, he was a leading philosopher of pragmatism, which was an intellectual movement that applied scientific methods to social problems. And in addition, Dewey created the university's laboratory school in 1896, which remains a vitally important part of our university today. In 1981, then Dean of the Law School, Gerhard Casper, decided the law school should recognize Dewey's many contributions, and he corresponded with philosopher Sidney Hook, who was then the president of the John Dewey Foundation, about establishing this lecture. And with Hook's enthusiastic support, this lecture was established. And through it, many esteemed philosophers have spoken here, Ronald Dworkin, Amy Gutman, Richard Rorty, among others. John Rawls's famous paper, The Idea of Public Reason Revisited, was itself a Dewey lecture and was then published in volume 64 of our Law Review. And so today I'm thrilled that we will continue this great tradition with today's Dewey lecturer, Cass Sunstein, or should I say we're happy to welcome him home to the law school. Professor Sunstein is the Robert Walmsley University professor at Harvard. He is also the founder and director of its program on behavioral economics and public policy at the law school there. Professor Sunstein is widely known as one of the most prolific scholars in the legal academy. This is true. He has written hundreds of articles, many hundreds upon hundreds of commentaries and op-eds, and dozens of books. Many of you may, of course, have read his work with Richard Thaler here across the Midway at Chicago booth, Nudge, which was an international bestseller. And more than his productivity, it is the creativity, the rigor of his mind, the discernment of his ideas that have made him one of the most influential scholars in the legal academy, or to be more accurate, I should just say the academy. Professor Sunstein's contributions span an incredible range of topics. His writings on constitutional law and administrative law are essential readings for anyone who wishes to understand those fields of law. And more than that, Professor Sunstein has advanced important methodological ideas from judicial interpretation, for example, his advocacy of judicial minimalism, to policymaking, such as cost-benefit analysis and libertarian paternalism, and ultimately to human nature itself with his work on behavioral economics and behavioral law and economics. Professor Sunstein's scholarship is marked by a deep mastery of the law, as well as an inspired interdisciplinarity that reaches the aspirations that Harper had for the interdisciplinary study of law. Time and again, Professor Sunstein has drawn on concepts and findings from other disciplines and advanced ideas that illustrate their application to law, advancing new insights, and often seeing social developments and trends and their consequences for law and our government and our society long before anyone else. His scholarship on happiness, conspiracy theories, the internet are just a few examples of his ability to see ahead in ways that others could not. Professor Sunstein obtained his law and undergraduate degrees at Harvard. He clerked for Chief Justice Benjamin Kaplan of the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts, and then clerked for Justice Thurgood Marshall on the U.S. Supreme Court. In addition to his academic career, he has been an important public servant. He, for example, served as administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. And for 27 years, he was a member of our faculty, becoming the Carl Llewellyn Distinguished Service Professor, and was jointly appointed in the Department of Political Science. I am thrilled that today he will talk about goods that people buy but wish did not exist. Welcome home, Professor Sunstein.
Well, it's a complete thrill and honor to be back home. When I was very little, 2 years old, I said to my mother at a very vulnerable point, I want to be a University of Chicago professor when I grow up. And she said, well, you probably need a therapist. And then when I was 7, I said, I have an even higher aspiration, and it's not really thinkable, but I'd like to be the Dewey Lecturer at the University of Chicago. And my mother said, aren't you interested in Little League? And I said, that too. So to be here is indescribable, to be here marching in the footsteps of heroes, both literally walking here and also giving these remarks. I should say that there's philosophy embedded in these remarks, and there are two things maybe to call out. One is John Stuart Mill's widely neglected arguments on behalf of maximum hour legislation, where he referred to the collective action problem faced by workers and urged that in the interest of freedom and welfare, maximum hour legislation was actually good. And another set of writings, including by Professor Nussbaum, have to do with well-being and how to think about it. And the title of this set of remarks obviously reflects an interest in how to think about well-being. But before we get to the substance, I think we want to note that there are ghosts, really good ghosts, in this building, and some of them are alive and kicking, kicking like a lot, but not physically here, and others are haunting in the best sense. There's the building, the building. There's Gerhard Casper, referred to in the opening remarks, who helped create the culture, the best legal culture, not only in the United States, but in the world. And if there's anyone who is an architect of the culture, it's really bottom up rather than top down, but part of the bottom up force came from my first dean, Gerhard Casper. There's Edward Levy, and what I think one needs to say about Edward Levy is he's the only person, at least I've ever seen, who can dominate a meeting in which he says less than anyone. So Levy could run a meeting by being the quietest person in it, because everything he said had such weight and wisdom that it took everything in exactly the right direction. There's Judge Posner, Richard Posner, who for so many of us has been defining, in part by posing questions that we're trying to figure out answers to, in part by establishing a methodology which we either embrace or fight with. And in any case, he can say to everyone in this room in a Obi-Wan Kenobi way or a Darth Vader after he became Anakin again, I am your father. Thanks, Dad. There's Gary Becker, who haunted this institution in the best way, the founder of rational actor models, which aren't quite right. But what Becker helped all of us as his descendants in one or another way ask was in response to any proposition of fact, at least, Becker would say, how can we test that? And that question still, for many of us, is top of mind. There's Stephen Holmes, who was on this faculty. Some of you are nodding. I think the most slashing defender of liberalism as a creed. And by liberalism, I don't mean left of center. I mean the idea that individual autonomy is central to a well-functioning pluralistic society, and embracing rather than combating pluralism is a very good thing to do. And Holmes's slashing defense of liberalism, I think, is in some ways what the doctor ordered for educational institutions and polity now. Okay, then, you just heard a little bit about some people who are intellectually central to American thought now in one or another way. You may have noticed they're all guys. And so I want to call out for two different reasons, Barbie, one of which is it's a profoundly feminist movie. You've seen it and you saw that, yes? And subversively so. That's the movie, but there's also Barbie the toy. And I'm not a fan of, I'm a huge fan of Barbie the movie, not so much of Barbie the toy. And so we want to think about goods that people buy but wish did not exist, of which Barbie may be an exemplar. Okay, the suggestion is that the pervasiveness of goods that we buy either through time or money has implications for consumer behavior, markets generally, freedom of speech and religion, privacy rights, which we may buy or pay something to allow relinquishment of, social media use, uses of AI, and climate change. So I feel I have right here a tiger by the tail. This is very much work in progress, and the proposition is Barbies, understood as goods that we buy, but which did not exist. They are pervasive, and once we're alert to them, we have, Houston, we have a problem. Tom Hanks was an astronaut before he was an actor. Did you know that? He was, I'm right on this, yes, he was Apollo 13, or was that a movie? Okay. Okay, social media I've said as an example. I'm going to use it because I have some data on it. Here are some slides involving Instagram, where Instagram, basically all you need to know is it now creates, this is very recent, teen accounts in which all teenagers are opted into private accounts in which restrictions of multiple kinds are imposed on usage and engagement. So if you're of a certain age, there is a restriction on freedom, in some sense, whose kind of most defining characteristics include time limit reminders and sleep mode enabled, where teens get notification telling them leave after 6 minutes every day. And after 10 p.m., it turns out that sleep mode is automatically activated, which mutes notifications overnight, and there are auto replies. Okay, in some sense, that's a restriction on freedom, but we want to think about there's a sense in which it's the opposite of this. And the implicit suggestion here is that Instagram usage is a good that teens buy through their time, but they wish did not exist. Now, we need data to support that proposition. Okay, there's big game here, which is the right not to be manipulated. Early in the 20th century, the work actually quite a little bit preceded the 20th century, Brandeis and Warren urged that there needs to be a right of privacy, which would be a constellation of rights organized under that rubric. A suggestion is that the right to not to be manipulated has the same feature in 2025 as the right to privacy did those many years ago. There's no unitary thing called manipulation, I suggest. It has multiple faces like privacy. What's wrong with manipulation, I suggest, is the same thing that's wrong with coercion and deception. They are three intrusions on both autonomy and welfare, in which the ability of the chooser to decide on life course is compromised by virtue of the existence of manipulation, coercion, and deception. So for autonomy reasons, Kantian reasons, they are the same evil. And if we're utilitarians, a la Mill, thinking that choosers generally know best what's in their interest, coercion, deception, and manipulation have the same feature. If you're lied to, if you're tricked, if you're stopped, if you know best what's in your own interest, I'm supposing there's no harm to others, there's an intrusion on your ability to make your life go as well as you like. So my suggestion is that a right to not to be manipulated places manipulation in contact with coercion and deception. But we're dealing now with a different form of manipulation, which has the feature of the stag hunt game in game theory, and I'm going to say a little bit about exactly why. It is a different form of manipulation. Now, I'm going to try to get at this through 3 studies, all of which seem to me extremely confusing in a good way. And I'm pleased to say that one of the studies that's confusing is my own, because I don't know what to make of it. And here's my study. It's a nationally representative study, very large scale, in which America is asked, how much would you be willing to pay to use basically all social media outlets? Asked individually, but asked individually for all of them. How much would you be willing to pay for a month of using Facebook? How much would you be willing to pay to use the artist formerly known as Twitter for a month? How much would you be willing to pay for YouTube? And the number I get from America is really low. $5 on average for most outlets, with something like a 20 to 40% zero number. So willingness to pay is tiny, tiny, tiny. Willingness to accept, by contrast, is pretty high, in the vicinity of $100. So often the average will be for willingness to pay 10 to 20, and for willingness to accept 50 to 100. Is it clear that this is a puzzling finding? It's inconsistent with the Coase theorem, which suggests that where transaction costs are 0, we should get the same result regardless of where the entitlement is allocated. And here we're getting not just the long-standing finding of an endowment effect, where the initial allocation of the entitlement affects valuation, but we're getting a spectacularly high endowment effect, a super endowment effect. Typically, the ratio between willingness to pay and willingness to accept is 1 to 2. Here, the ratio is 1 to 20. I'm aware of no other area in which the endowment effect is that big. Seems to be the biggest endowment effect ever observed. That's a puzzle. How do we explain it? One possible reason is when people are asked how much are you willing to pay to use a social media outlet, they're really mad. They formerly enjoyed it for free, asked how much would you pay to use, let's say, Facebook. They say, you're kidding, right? Nothing. Or, you're kidding, right? $5. That might explain the smallness of the willingness to pay number. I asked my daughter, who's 12 years old, how much she'd be willing to pay to use Instagram, which she uses. And she said, nothing, Daddy, I don't have any money. And I asked her, well, suppose you had money. How much would you be willing to pay? And she said, nothing. And I said, why? And she said, I just waste my time on Instagram. It's not helping me. Okay, so one possible answer is that these are wasting time goods for a large number of the users, and they understand that there's a mismatch between their behavior and their well-being. And what we're observing is a rejection of revealed preferences as a measure of well-being on the part of America with respect to social media use. Okay, that's a point about some critiques by former Dewey lecturer Amartya Sen of using revealed preferences as a welfare measure. Another possibility is there's something in the nature of social media use in the willingness to pay question that suggests social media is a Barbie. But I have to explain that, and that's going to take a few minutes. Notice that none of these explanations gets at why the willingness to accept number is quite high, and it's not clear why it's high. I think we would have to say that neither measure is a reliable welfare measure. There are too many other things going on in the survey, and even possibly in actual behavior, to be confident that willingness to pay is an adequate measure of welfare, or that willingness to accept is an adequate measure of welfare. Okay, the study I've just described is a very straightforward survey that had a high degree of simplicity, as befits someone who is impatient to get results. The second study I'm going to tell you about is by a more patient person named Hunt Alcott, who asked Facebook users, it's very limited to Facebook users, how much would you demand to be off Facebook for a month? And it turned out that his numbers in a more high-class study than mine produced basically the same kinds of results in the vicinity of 50 to 100. That's around the median willingness to accept. But he went another step and said to them, okay, people, if you're willing to accept 100, and he took the number that said that in a very large group, if you're willing to accept 100, I'll take you up on that offer. And here's $100 you off for a month. And it was randomized, so half of a large group was off for a month. This is thousands and nationally representative. And thousands stayed on. They weren't given the offer. So we have a whole bunch are off for a month and another bunch not off for a month. And what happened was the experimenters asked people regularly, it was an interesting month for them, how happy are you with your life? How satisfied are you with your life? Are you feeling depressed? Are you feeling anxious? So along every measure of well-being that they could form words to assess, they asked people in real time repeatedly, how are you doing? And the question is whether the people who were off Facebook for a month would look different for that month than the people who were on Facebook. This is our more direct welfare measure. It's also a survey, but more direct than willingness to pay numbers. And I want to ask you just to think, what would you expect? Okay, here's the answer. People who were off Facebook were, along every measure of reported well-being, better off. That was a good month for them. They were less depressed, less anxious, they were more satisfied with their lives, and they were happier. Everything under the sun, they were better off being off for a month. But here's the big puzzle with respect to welfare, which is that there's an anomaly, which is after the month, people were asked, how much would you demand to be off another month? And they said, on average, $87. That's an anomaly because after the month, they should have said, we'll pay you. We want to be off. But instead they said $87. Now that's a staggering result, I think. The reason is that it should be much lower. Is it that the welfare measures that Alcott and team used didn't capture the actual benefits of being on? Is it that there was something in social media usage that's a benefit that isn't about life satisfaction? It might be about knowledge, it might be about connection, or is there some kind of addiction in place such that people say, I'm going to have to stay on? The paper doesn't tell you the answer. Okay, here's the structure of the problem that I'm focused on. Imagine there's a party at the Study Hotel, which I was just at, excellent hotel. Imagine there's a party this Saturday night. Imagine that many of the members of this community are going to be there. Imagine you have two options, go or don't go. It's imaginable looking at you all, and I see the confusion about, do I really want to go to this party? The confusion might be you think contingent on being a party, you're going to go. At the same time, and I didn't notice the light in the room when I signaled the existence of a Saturday party, you might prefer another option, that is that the party not take place. So you might wish on reflection that the party not be arranged or be canceled. So your preference ordering is no party, party and go, and third, party and not go. Okay, why might that be? One reason might be that if you don't go, you'll signal that you are a hermit or a recluse or a misanthrope, and you don't want to give any of those signals. So the preference ordering is thus explained. Or you might think that you don't want to miss the party because there are opportunities for relationship building. Now, if you really cared about those opportunities, you wouldn't want the party to be canceled. There's a dinner, by the way, annually in Washington called the Washington Correspondents' Dinner. And I'm pretty confident a lot of people go sad about the existence of the party, thinking that they don't want to be someone who's not at the Washington Correspondents' Dinner, though it's a madhouse. Okay. You might think that people will take advantage of opportunities if they go, and if you don't, you'll be at a comparative advantage. Okay, drinking, talking for a long time, there's data on that. Political activity and charitable giving might all be Barbies. They might have all the same structure. There are a number of questions to be raised about each of the cases. If there's ever been a situation in which you said, sure, I'll have a drink of liquor when you really don't want to, but don't want to give the signal, then that's a suitable example. Okay, I said this is like the stag hump game, and this is going to be a resonant example for reasons you'll see, I hope. There are two people. You can choose to hunt a rabbit or a stag. You have to choose. If you hunt the stag, you really need the cooperation of your partner. You can get a rabbit by yourself. So that's the structure. Stag hunt game has two Nash equilibria. One is risk dominant and the other is payoff dominant. Stag is payoff dominant. You get a bigger meal. If you are risk focused, you will go rabbit. Because if there's uncertainty, you might want to go for the rabbit. Of course, you'd want to assess probabilities to figure this out. Let's just take it in this simple form. Okay, what I'm exploring is rabbit, where people can't coordinate, so they do the equivalent of buying the Barbie. I say this is a resonant example because some of you, I hope, are thinking, what about the stag? What about the rabbit? And hold on a second, we're going to get to animal rights soon. Silencing oneself, buying things, and consenting to things might have the structure of the problem I'm describing. So people might shut up, they might buy things, or they might consent to things for the same reasons that are applicable in the Saturnate party. So the shared characteristic is there's a good that people consume or an activity in which they engage, even though they wish the good or activity didn't exist. Let's refocus on Instagram, which said before it ramped up its solution to what I think it thinks of as a Barbie problem. Time for a break. Consider closing Instagram for the night. This is the nighttime nudge for teens. It appeared when teens spent more than 10 minutes on the platform. And while they can dismiss the reminder, they can't turn off the feature. And the implicit argument is that Instagram believes that it is, with respect to teens, a Barbie, and they want to protect people against that intrusion on their freedom. Okay, funerals might be Barbies. This is complicated, but if you've ever thought, if contingent on there being a funeral, I'm going to go. But if I wasn't invited to the funeral, I wouldn't mind. There we go. Weddings might be Barbies. If you've ever thought I'm invited, but I wish I hadn't been, that's the structure of the problem. Meat eating might be a Barbie, where not eating meat might at certain times and places give a signal to people that you're a certain kind of person, but you might wish that the meat eating option weren't available such that the signal wouldn't be given. Political quiescence might be a Barbie, where at some times and places it has exactly the structure of the problem we're discussing. This isn't a problem of adaptive preferences. It's a problem of the small number of participants make it so that the signal you give by participating is not so good. Political activity might be a Barbie. Kissing the ring of a leader, there are lots of variations on that, might have the same structure of the problem. Okay, if we want to broaden the view screen a lot, the regulatory state often has a kind of philosophical issue at its core, which is you ask people how much they're willing to pay for X and Y and Z in a situation in which they can't coordinate with others. How much are you willing to pay to protect an endangered species? You might say, not so much. What good would it do? But if everyone else were participating, then it might do a lot of good and the amount would jump. Paying for things you wish did not exist, that's the core example I'm using, and paying to protect statistical lives. Professor Posner, with a co-author who shall not be mentioned, worried over that problem where people are willing to pay something to protect themselves, and that's the core of government valuation. But people are also willing to pay something to protect others, particularly people they care about, but maybe a little bit for random others, and that's not taken into account. Okay, I think we have to contrast for funerals and weddings the fact that social norms often solve collective action problems. So it might be, take the funeral case, that people think if I'm invited to a funeral, I go, full stop. That might be thought to be kind of have a deontological justification, but it might also have a welfarist justification that if everyone has a commitment to going to a funeral if invited, that's in the collective interest because the value for people who are grieving is like really, really high, and the inconvenience for the people who don't want to go is not a big deal. And there's also a norm of reciprocity. So if you're grieving and vulnerable, people will come to the funeral that you want them to come to. And it might be that weddings also have that feature where you go if invited. That solves a collective action problem. Social norms often do that. That's not what I'm focusing. I'm focusing on cases of Barbies where the result is a welfare loss. Okay, this is abstract, and so we need data that makes it less abstract. And there's an economist happily at the University of Chicago who's written a paper which I think is Deweyan in spirit, though it's just data and kind of very simple tools, trying to get pragmatically at the value of social media outlets. And this is the third and last of the three puzzling studies, and it's the decisive one for purposes of the problem I'm focusing on. What the economist did was to ask college students, a large N, how much are you willing to pay to use, how much would you demand to give up using Instagram and TikTok? So just two outlets. And that's the same as the studies described so far, exactly the same. And the number they got was in the vicinity of the numbers in the earlier studies. Then people were asked, okay, contingent on everyone else at your university getting off of TikTok and Instagram, how much would you pay? Okay? How much would you pay for that equilibrium where how much would you demand for that equilibrium where everyone's off? Here are the findings. On average, users would demand $59 to get rid of TikTok and about $50 to get rid of Instagram. Very much ballpark of what you've heard before. But if they're asked how much they demand to get off those sites, contingent on everyone else in their university getting off, they said, oh, then we'd pay you. Got it? A large sample, college student TikTok and Instagram users said, me off? I'll pay a lot you're going to have to pay me a lot for that. Us all off, I'll pay you. For TikTok, about 2/3 of users said, we'll pay you. And on average, users would be willing to pay $28 to have all of their world be off TikTok, and $10 to do the same for Instagram. So this is a very clean finding of people demanding a lot of money to give up use of a good that they really wish did not exist. Okay, the basic idea is product traps are part of consumer markets, where 91% of iPhone users wish iPhones would be released every other year, not every year. And 94% of people not using the iPhone would like that. Professor Sen has a paper from 1995 worrying over valuation of the environment, in which he basically makes the same theoretical claim in mirror image, where people are willing to pay not a whole lot to protect the environment, but contingent on everyone else paying a lot to being asked to pay to protect the environment, they would be willing to pay a lot if they could solve the coordination problem. Okay, what are we going to do about this? And shall I say that some number of years ago, there were people at this law school, some of them in the room, and at the economics department here, worrying about problems that aren't this problem, but are in the same extended family of markets involving, let's say, hidden attributes or characteristics that people can't really get their mind around very well, and urging that they can be maneuvered into situations in which they're paying more money for goods than their lives would benefit from, and thinking what would be the regulatory response. And the suggestion is that this has the same characteristics. It's something where we're just starting to get a theoretical purchase on it, and the legal and regulatory responses have a TBD character. Okay, with respect to private action, party givers can cease and desist or invite fewer. Companies can manipulate people or not. I almost wore a tie to give this talk, thinking, what would you all think if I didn't wear a tie? Only to be informed by one member of this audience that no one wears a tie anymore. Okay? Ties and high heels and meat have characteristic of Barbie's problems. Okay, let's notice hat tip to Professor Posner that sometimes people are engaging in an action that forces another person to make a choice that reveals information about that person that the person doesn't want to disclose, or that gives a signal that that person doesn't want to give. And that dilemma isn't arising by accident. It's a product of P's clever, mischievous, or self-interested action. So then the question is what to do about that. Okay, let's notice, shall we, that addictions are quite different. That in the case of addiction, people contingent on being addicted don't want the good not to exist. They need the good. That is not a situation in which rational people would want on the ground for the good to be abolished. Okay, here's a song, University of Chicago song, our favorite song. Do you all know Olivia Rodrigo? Does any of you know her personally? She's really good, yes? Maybe she can sing a song that's a little like this, but snappier. Some of you don't know Olivia Rodrigo. I'm very, very upset about that. Okay. She's a little like Taylor Swift, but more raw. Okay, less packaged. Okay, I'm a Taylor Swift fan, I should emphasize as well. So voluntary action is the best route typically through consumer pressures or the creation of a norm of some kind. But we can speculate that there are occasions for legal intervention. And to get at those occasions, I think it would be helpful to underline the most moving passage Mill ever wrote when he wasn't talking about himself. And when he talked about his relationship with Harriet Taylor and his father, he was very moving. When he talked about philosophy, he was typically powerful but not very emotional. This is one where Mill is on fire, saying, I must again repeat what the assailants of utilitarianism seldom have the justice to acknowledge, that the happiness which forms the utilitarian standard is not the agent's own happiness, but that of all concerned. As between his own happiness and that of others, utilitarianism requires him to be as strictly impartial as a disinterested and benevolent spectator. In the golden rule of Jesus of Nazareth, we read the complete spirit of the ethics of utility. Okay, good guide. For a purpose of law and policy, there are cases in which we're going to see serious welfare losses. And we might have examples of cases in which more aggressive nudges for social media, restrictions on waivers of rights, and taxes or bans on Barbies would be welfare promoting. So we have a repertoire of tools here. We might want to emphasize that fewer parties, dinners, meat eatings, and TikToks might be interest of people who willingly go to parties, go to dinners, eat meat, and enjoy, quote unquote, TikTok. In late 2024, TikTok faced famously a ban. This has been argued in the Supreme Court. This is not part of the legal case, but to emphasize that the end of TikTok for American users might be in the interest of American consumers if the data which you've heard is correct. The broader idea signaled is a right not to be manipulated, is an idea whose time has come. The White House emphasized a few months ago that Americans should not be subject to confusing, manipulative, or deceptive practices online. It urged that hidden fees are one example, and the effort is to attack them. A plea is this is a possible response to the White House's question, what else should we take on? The White House is calling for ideas for how federal action can give them their time back. This is a new frontier for theory and practice, hence the tentativeness and sense of inquiry of the remarks you've heard. But the idea is this is fundamental to freedom and welfare under contemporary conditions. Gratitude is not a Barbie. Thank you. So the floor is open. Questions?
Students are first.
Students are first, I'm told. And that's an interest. That's theoretically interesting. The students first. Yes. Yeah.
So especially when it comes to social media, I think it was striking sort of how the willingness to let go of social media increases when there's less of your peers engaged in similar practice. So how does one combat this fear, frankly, this fear of missing out in a way, that maybe tax can address? How do we get to that root problem of sort of these social underlying factors which add to the addiction or willingness or lack of willingness to part?
Okay, so the idea that social media has network benefits, so you like it more if more people are involved, that's kind of fundamental and unsurprising. The, I think, more surprising idea is people would want to abolish TikTok or Instagram, and they'd pay for that. So it's not just the more the better, it's abolish. Instagram's response to the situation in which it finds itself, I think, is best understood as implicitly aware of not the network effect, but the Barbiness. Is this tracking? That when Instagram says it's sleep time, it's not Instagram time, it's saying that you're better off if you're not on. And the reason you're on is because other people are on. So we're going to give you what we think you would, if informed and not behaviorally biased, root for. Now, it might be that a form, is this paternalism? It's not conventional paternalism because it's responsive to a collective action problem which individuals can't solve on their own. So that's the basic idea. It's crucial, but not that striking to say some goods are ones whose value increases with the number of people using them. Of course. But to say that there's a category of goods which people would rather no one use, that's something. I'll give you two homely examples, shall I, of private action, which I think responsive to your question. My sister said a number of years ago that on Christmas, no adult is giving any other adult a present. That's the rule. And everyone was so happy about that because people struggled to find presents and no one enjoyed the presents. Present giving was a Barbie. In the government, I know someone who a number of years ago said, every half-hour meeting is now going to be a 15-minute meeting, and every hour meeting is now going to be a half-hour meeting. And by and large, people thought, that's great, because long meetings were Barbies. And people focused once a meeting was a 15-minute meeting. And so private action can work, but notice this is in small communities. So my hope is you'll think of cases where there's some liberty loss or welfare loss, where revealed preferences are screwing us up. Fear of missing out, thank you for referring to that. That's complicated. It has multiple faces. It might be that people want to go to the Washington Correspondents' Dinner because it's going to be really fun. They don't want to miss out. Now, then it's not a Barbie. They don't want it not to exist. But if they're thinking, I don't want to be seen as the sort of person who's not at the Washington Correspondents' Dinner, that's kind of pathetic, but captures at least 500 people and probably at least 3,000 people, then we're talking about a Barbie. Yeah.
This is about your study specifically. You said you were surprised about the $87 for the second month. I was actually expecting it to be 100, not 0, because if it's in your welfare to not have the social media, it's even more in your welfare to get paid for it.
Good. Okay. So this is the Alcott study, not my study. So just I want to take credit for his study. So you would have thought they'd say 100 because they're bargaining, or
because
they had a great month, and then they're saying instead, hit me again. Like,
I thought they're getting paid for not using it, right?
Yes. And the question is, how much would they demand? And so you would think after a good month of being off Facebook, they should say, use the technology to block me. And you don't have to pay me anything. I benefit from that. So the surprise is that they demanded almost as much after a good month.
I guess my question is, don't people want as much as they can get?
Want as much money as they can get?
As much of anything they value.
Sure. But the $87 signals, if people offered them $80 to be off Instagram, they'd say no.
Well, but isn't that an average, though? So
That's an average,
Some
yeah.
people would say no, but maybe the majority would say, maybe we need a different.
Well, if people would offer whatever amount, the question is whether they're actually going to be paid, and if the amount's too high, they're not. So people could, on the theory that demand as much as you can, they should have said $1 million.
Well, if they were basing it on inductively on the previous month, they would demand 100 because they were able to demand that last month.
Well, they don't know what people, they're in a bargaining situation. They don't know what the other side's going to say. So you're asking a completely fair question, but I think it's not senseless to assume they think that the other side is going to accept the offer or not. And their measure of $87 is how much they think it's worth to be off Instagram for a month. And that's the loss they would incur. That's the monetary equivalent of the loss they would incur. I'm thinking that you have a laptop. I really like that laptop. You know where I'm going, don't you? How much would, how much do I have to pay you for you to give it to me?
As long as I can transfer all my stuff. Enough to get a new computer.
which is approximately $1,000. And that's okay. So you didn't say $20 and you didn't say $10,000. You said you gave the answer that I think people are giving in the context of the survey, which is what's it worth to me? And you went there intuitively, very precisely. That was good. That was amazing.
Happy to apply.
But if you said 10,000, I would say absolutely not. Given what you said, I'm actually kind of interested. Looks like a good computer. And that's how bargaining, intuitively would work.
Well, I'm trying to be respectful and not ask too much.
But it wouldn't be disrespectful. It's just you wouldn't have a deal. So if you said, I love this computer, you're going to have to give me $30,000. I'd say, I hear you, and I'm not buying. And I think, now, of course, you're right. The three studies you heard, they're all very early, but they're highly suggestive of, one, a massive disparity between willingness to pay and willingness to accept in the context of social media use and what's going on there. Two, people are willing to demand significant money for a good that makes them sad. Can I give you a little account of what might be going on in the second study? Okay, I told you that along every measure of well-being, people who were off social media were a little better off in a month than the equivalent people who were on. That's true. But there was one measure along which the people who were on were better off. It's not about subjective welfare. They knew more about politics. So the people who stayed on for that month knew more about politics than the people who stayed off. Now, what do we make of that? One view would be that $87 reflects a conception of welfare that isn't about subjective well-being. So people thought, I want to know more, even though it's making me anxious and depressed. And you're going to have to pay me you're going to have to pay me for something that ensures a degree of ignorance of politics. Not infinite, but 87. And the author's preferred explanation of what I see as an anomaly is that people are demanding money for not knowing things. I wonder, I think there's something else. It might be they anchored on their own $100 and they thought $100 last time, it's kind of a good month, so I'll go a little down from $100. That would be the behavioral explanation. Yeah, David.
So I think you were in the room when I was there, when Robert Frank presented the paper,
Yeah.
The relative base population. The question is how different this is than Frank's thesis.
Okay, so Frank's theory is that some goods are positional goods.
Why lie?
Okay, so the goods are positional goods in the sense that you care about them not for their intrinsic value to you, but how they compare to what other people have.
For example, schools. You don't want to buy a house in a really fancy neighborhood, but you want the school. You know so many people that buy their schools, so you spend more in the house. Extra bedroom
Right.
you buy, you don't want to buy.
Okay, so we need to figure out, okay, so health is not a positional good, or not very much so. People, if you ask people, would you rather be healthy and live a long life in a society in which people are spectacularly healthy and live crazy long lives, or in a society in which you're not that healthy and live a short life, but people are super unhealthy and live very short lives? People prefer the first. So health, they want regardless of the comparison set. With respect to cars, it flips. That how wonderful a car is, people care about how it is compared to other people's cars. Money tends to be a positional good. Would you rather live in a society in which you earn $200,000 and a year and everyone else earns $150, or a society in which you earn $250,000 and everyone else earns $300,000? Assuming this is real purchasing power, people care about relative. Now, we need to know why. I think you're suggesting this, David. We need to know why people care about relative, and that there are different reasons they might. It might be envy. It might be that you think that where you are in the hierarchy has an assortment of other goods or bads associated with it, or it might be that the good sets a frame of reference So if you have, I was driving in Tom Ginsburg's car yesterday, which is a 1992 car, and in some respects, it is less amazing than it was in 1992. It was pretty amazing. But in all respects, it was amazing in 1992. For you all, if you were in it, there are some things about it that would bother you. Like it doesn't get warm really quickly. But that wasn't so bad back then. So there's clearly it's in the same family. I think it might be that the positional feature of a positional good has the characteristic of a good that people wish did not exist, but we'd have to disaggregate features of goods, and that gets complicated. So it's in the same family. Yeah.
So I agree that I think the second part of the Hunt-Alcott study is the puzzle that still hasn't yet been explained. And I think it matters a lot in terms of the public policy intervention that you want to advocate for. I mean, if he's missing some measure of welfare and actually people are better off when they have social media, then we shouldn't do anything. And on the other hand, if it's really an addiction, you can't stop yourself from going back, then we need to maybe intervene very strenuously. But like, it's peculiar that everyone spent a month hunting stags and did well at it and succeeded, and then they want to go right back to hares afterwards. So I guess I want to suggest a third possibility and hear your reaction. I think, as you're undoubtedly well aware, regret aversion is a very powerful force, we think, with human behavior. People really don't want to regret things after the fact. And it might be that the fact that people were being paid to not use social media and then they sort of had, I assume, functionally turned off on their phones means that it wasn't a choice and that they felt bound and thus there was nothing to regret. I might be missing out on things, but there's nothing I can do about it. I haven't, that wasn't my own decision or something like that. And if that's what's actually going on there, that people would like to be off, but they feel like they'll regret it too much if they're the ones making themselves be off, then we need some sort of masked time mechanism. We need some way for people to like pre-commit to get themselves off in a binding way. And that would be all that's required. We wouldn't even necessarily have to pay them very much.
Yeah, so that's great. The people in an admittedly small family who were subject to a no presence for adults rule have never regretted that. And the people in a larger family of employees who were subject to a 15 or 30-minute meeting rule didn't regret that. So that's kind of a good reality check. I like that, but I'm thinking if it's anticipated regret by virtue of the exercise of one's own agency, that's honorable, but it might be that the welfare consequence is not adequately captured. So this is let's say a non-sectarian welfarist paper, which has some version of Mill's utilitarianism as its heart. And that would, and I think you're with me, that would be the engine of evaluation. That's all.
How do you know when something's a Barbie or something needs a social planner? It's sort of a Mill versus Sunstein kind of question. So, for example, lots and lots of people, let's say 70% of the people who finish college because they think they need to finish college to get a job because everybody else is going to college. So if we polled them, if we did your kind of poll, unlike the two of us, most people would say, oh, it'd be so great if we could eliminate college. But I have a feeling Mill might think that's great, but I doubt that you think that's great, and you would stand up here and say we need a social policy that gets rid of college and all that. So how do we know when it's Barbie and when it's college?
Well, we want to know what college does for people independently of keeping them in a certain place in a hierarchy. So if college is for students like social media use, then there's something really wrong with how higher education is working. If there are 1,001 things that come from college attendance, aside from not falling in a arms race, then we wouldn't want to abolish college. So this is very Dewey. It's a good Deweyan question. And the idea would be that, and Mill struggled with this, whether to be a kind of Benthamite or whether to have a conception of welfare which isn't narrowly utilitarian, let's say. He talked about higher and lower pleasures, better to be Socrates, unsatisfied than a satisfied pig. That's kind of a crude way of talking about higher education. And so I'd be inclined to say that Mill in the end would be emphatically with higher education and not want to characterize it as a Barbie. Now, could social media use be defended in the end through that rationale? Maybe. And the fact that we don't know enough, but it might be that the political knowledge that people gain is on, Millian grounds of this kind rather than Benthamite grounds. I don't believe this to be true, but a good argument for social media. So people get political knowledge. Notice, if you would, that the Barbiness of TikTok is more clearly established by the data than the Barbiness of Instagram. So the TikTok users are more dramatic in their desire to see everyone off than the Instagram users. And that might be diagnostic along the lines you're suggesting.
I think we have time for one more.
Yeah, no pressure.
So I get the impression from your lecture that it would make sense if we ban things and if we ban a lot more of them. But I also hear you talking about like John Stuart Mill, and it seems like you maybe have some of the libertarian leanings as well. So like, how should I make sense of all of that? And like, who should be doing the banning, and like, what levels of government do you think?
Okay, so this isn't a talk that's excited about banning. It's trying to get at the fundamentals of welfare and liberty in a context where people, not planners, people wish that a good didn't exist, which they buy or spend time on, buy through money or time. And the fundamental plea is that voluntary private action is the first line of defense, not government action. Should there be some sorts of regulatory things, I wouldn't want to have a strong prior on that. I want to analyze the situation first and see what we come up with. I applaud Instagram's initiative. All the data suggests it's a good idea. Should the government spur that? There are 1,000 questions that have to be asked before answering that.
Please join me in thanking Chris for coming.
Thank you.